Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 4. Today we'll be discussing incorporating direct quotes. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for our lecture assignment. First, you'll need access to your current Project 1 draft wherever you may be at in the drafting process. You'll also need access to the artifact that you're analyzing for Project 1, and finally, you'll need a document to write on. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll explore the rhetorical affordances of using direct quotes in our writing. Then we'll also discuss the ethics of using direct quotes. And finally, we'll examine methods for properly introducing and framing direct quotes. Before, though, we define what a direct quote is and talk about the ways in which we can effectively include direct quotes in our writing, we first want to ask the question, why do we borrow from others? And we want to answer that question because this not only applies to our use of direct quotes, but also if we decide to summarize or paraphrase a source. So why as writers do we borrow from others? While we could probably brainstorm a fairly extensive list, I imagine most of those reasons could fit under one of these umbrella reasons that we're about to discuss. First, perhaps a source has research findings or data that are otherwise inaccessible to you as the writer. So, for example, we could say the USGS reported that Bear Lake will receive necessary water quality and weather monitoring equipment by late April. Perhaps you as the writer and members of your audience are not members or do not work for the USGS and wouldn't have immediate access to that information discussing when Bear Lake would get that equipment otherwise. And so you as the writer are saying, hey, if I want to provide my readers with an exact date, I'm going to need to borrow from the USGS and when they anticipate that equipment will be available. We also tend to borrow from others in writing, especially academic writing, to appeal to authority in an argument. Remember last week we discussed the concepts of logos, pathos, and ethos, with ethos being the appeal to authority. Of course, there are two different ways that we can view ethos and its persuasive appeal. So first, a writer or speaker can rely upon themselves as an expert, and they can rely upon the fact that the audience already accepts them as an expert on the topic that they're discussing. Remember, our example for that would be a priest speaking to a congregation and saying this is how you can interpret this scripture. Well, the congregation in that case would accept the priest as an expert in it of themselves. So they would say, okay, this person has studied extensively at a seminary. They have worked in this position for years. So if they say this is how you interpret this scripture or this text, I'm going to believe them. The other way that we can look at ethos is when writers or speakers who perhaps do not have that immediately recognizable expertise in the field when they cite experts. So it's like the teenager quoting the priest when speaking in front of the congregation. The congregation might not see the teenager as authoritative on scripture interpretation, but what they will see is, oh, this teenager is quoting the priest, therefore the teenager did their research and we should view their thoughts on this scripture as authoritative and as well researched and valid. That, like we discussed last week, is more common in academic writing. So academic writers will tend to, in some way, shape, or form, rely on the expertise of others to support their own ideas and arguments. And so they'll often include direct quotes in this case, but also, you'll see summaries and paraphrases as well. But they will use the words of others, they will borrow from others to make their argument seem more authoritative and better grounded in what that particular field deems, acceptable in terms of theories, philosophies, or findings. So for example, if we look at this, we must increase our local efforts to provide material goods for those in need. For as Pope Francis observed, blessed therefore are the open hands that embrace the poor and help them. They are hands that bring hope. So, if we're making the argument that we shouldn't or we must increase our local efforts to provide material good for those in need, if you're speaking perhaps to a religious audience, maybe incorporating a direct quote from Pope Francis, who your audience might see as authoritative, they might say, okay, well, if this person that we recognize as an authority is saying this, then yes, maybe we should accept the speaker's argument. So you can see how borrowing from others can also help in terms of appealing to ethos or appealing to authority. So finally, we can borrow from others to provide further context or explanation for a concept. So in her memoir, Tina Fey stresses the importance of providing creative agency to those she works with and those who work for her. More specifically, she writes, in most cases, being a good boss means hiring talented people and then getting out of their way. So maybe the first sentence might be a little muddy for the reader. Maybe they don't know exactly what you mean by recalling Tina Fey's words in this way, or maybe the way that the initial explanation of the concept is presented, or the way that it's presented again might still be a bit murky for the reader, but by incorporating the thoughts of others, and in this case a direct quote, might be able to clarify any confusion that the reader might have. Now that we have discussed why we would borrow from others in our own writing, let's now look a little closer at what a direct quote is and how we can embed that effectively in our own original text. So direct quote, it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It's when you use the exact words of someone else in your own original text. In academic writing especially, we as writers will use direct quotes to support our own argument or analysis. So for example, let's go and look at this second example, the appeal to authority. So the argument is we must increase our local efforts to provide material goods for those in need. Now, that's the argument being presented, but then we follow it up directly with, for as Pope Francis observed, blessed therefore, and then we carry on with the quote. Now, that direct quote is used to basically support and to function as evidence for the writer's original argument. So you could do that for your analysis as well. So as you're going through in project one, if you're saying, okay, well, this is how the writer, the speaker, the artist, this is how they apply to, let's say, pathos, a specific emotion, you could use a direct quote to say, okay, well, look at this word and this word that they use in this sentence or that they use in this line. We can see that this word and this word could evoke this emotion that I'm observing as the speaker, artist, or writer's attempt at this specific emotion. So by using a direct quote, you can basically use the author's exact words or exact choices to supplement your own observations. With today's communication technologies, we can gather direct quotes from several avenues. The most common still, though, in academic writing will be published writings. Now, that can be either digital or print, depending on what kind of information you're going for and where it is most readily accessible. So examples of digital published writings, perhaps you find a solid blog post. Maybe you have located an online open access scholarly journal, or even a tweet. A tweet, as commonplace as it sounds, is an example of a digital piece of published writing. More often than not, though, you will still see print works or direct quotes found from print works being used more in academic writing. So that would be perhaps a journal article or a book on the topic you're interested in, or a textbook, something of that sort. You can also get direct quotes from speaking engagements. Now, this can be perhaps if a candidate is giving a campaign speech at a town hall, maybe you go and listen to a speaker at one of the forums that the university hosts. You can also get them from interviews as well. Now, these can be interviews that you yourself conduct through primary research. So, if you are wanting to make an argument regarding education, maybe you conduct an interview with an elementary school teacher and you use their direct or their exact words through a direct quote to support the argument you're making. You can also find interviews that are conducted by someone else. Maybe you're watching a morning talk show and they interview your favorite athlete, and your favorite athlete gives a quote during that interview that you think speaks to an argument you're making on college athletes. So there are a number of ways that we can locate and utilize these direct quotes. Now, why use direct quotes? Why not just paraphrase or summarize the entire time? Why use the exact words of someone else in our own original text? There are a few really solid reasons to do this. First, you can use the source's actual words, whether that be if they are posing as a counter argument, so it's easier to sort of pick apart what they're saying if you can use their own words against them, so to speak. Or, if you find that um, a piece of writing or the quote that you're using, perhaps that you find that it is poetic and eloquent and you want the reader to experience it firsthand, that would be a good reason to use a direct quote. So, like, let's say if you are quoting Shakespeare, it's kind of hard to summarize or to paraphrase Shakespeare, and you might find it more rhetorically effective just to use Shakespeare's own words. It can also help with appeal to ethos, remember authority, and pathos. So, for example, if you're writing a paper on how um, public school teachers need to be paid more, maybe that's the argument you're trying to make. If you can include a direct quote from, let's say, a first grade teacher talking about how the pay isn't adequate. Maybe they've had to get a second or third job. Not only is that authoritative because you are speaking with and including direct quotes from people who are immediately affected by the issue that you're addressing, but, hearing firsthand, oh, this first grade teacher who is working with kids has to get a second and a third job, that's going to make your reader perhaps feel angry, feel sad, feel sympathetic toward the teacher, which can go to strengthen your argument. And that kind of emotion and authority might be lost if you, as the writer who may not be a teacher, decides to summarize or paraphrase the teacher's words. Also, and this sort of circles back to the first benefit that we looked at, direct quotes allow you to directly engage with a source using their own language. This is going to be especially important when you introduce counter arguments in Project 4. So if you can say, oh, this is exactly what the source said, you can then more engage with them rather than saying, oh, here's a paraphrase in which I'm going to engage with my own understanding that I've communicated through a paraphrase or a summary. But if you were to say, no, word for word, this is what a person said in this journal article or in this interview or during this TED Talk or whatever the case may be, you can basically you give yourself more material to work with than, again, if you're paraphrasing or you're summarizing, because you can demonstrate to your reader, this is what someone who stands in opposition to my argument says, and this is how I'm going to use their own words, their own exact words, to sort of pick it apart and further reinforce my own argument. Okay, now that we've talked about why we borrow from others and what the benefits of a direct quote can be, we want to start discussing how exactly we embed those in our own writing. The first thing that we'll want to do is we want to introduce the full title and author by full name. This is going to be par for the course, regardless of how you decide to borrow and cite another source. If you're summarizing or paraphrasing, it's always good practice to introduce the source by the full title and by the author's full name. And then from there on out, as we'll discuss in future lectures, you can just refer to the author by last name at that point. But anyway, let's circle back to structuring a direct quote. So, of course, we've introduced the full title and author by full name. So, in his recent article, Golden Knights' Popularity Builds Business for Las Vegas Ice Center, Al Mancini observes. So, we've got the full name of the article, and we've also got the full name of the author as well. And then we follow it up with a verb like says, observes, recommends, states, argues. So something along those lines that give us an idea of what kind of content you as the writer are about to quote. So if you say observes, notices, says, it's a little bit more objective. Perhaps they're about to just present, some more objective quantifiable data. But if you were to say argues, asserts, advocates, that indicates that it's going to be perhaps more opinion-based writing, perhaps on the conclusions that the source has reached. So after we've done that, we want to introduce the quote itself. So, in his recent article, Golden Knights' Popularity Builds Business for Las Vegas Ice Center, Al Mancini observes, quote, the Ice Center's main draw is hockey, which accounts for about 70% of its business. So again, it was more of, hey, here are some of the more cold numbers, if you will. Here are some of, just the plain numbers on the business for the Ice Center. So we have the direct quote immediately following our verb observes. But again, that could also be advocates, argues, says, states, whatever you feel is most appropriate. Now, finally, whenever we use a direct quote, we want to conclude with a statement of relevance. So it's not enough to say, here's the full title of the piece that I'm citing, here's the full name of the author, and here's the quote. We want to tell our readers why we have included that quote. What does that quote do for our analysis, for our argument? So if we look at this example here, in his recent article, Golden Knights' Popularity Builds Business for Las Vegas Ice Center, Al Mancini observes the Ice Center's main draw is hockey, which accounts for about 70% of its business. This demonstrates that the Golden Knights have had a positive impact on the Las Vegas community, especially as it relates to physical health and well-being. So, we are telling our reader, this is why we find this, this is why I, as the writer, find this quote important. This is how it speaks to my overall argument or my overall analysis. So, if you were to introduce a direct quote from the artifact that you're working on, and that you're analyzing for Project One, perhaps you follow up to say, this quote demonstrates that the main appeal to logos, or the main appeal is to logos for this reason, or this demonstrates that the speaker or the author or the artist really wanted to focus in on anger or happiness as their main attempt at pathos or their main attempt at emotion. So, anytime we do borrow from others, we always want to conclude with a statement of relevance. We always want to explicitly tell our readers, hey, as the writer, this is how I see this quote is important. This is why I decided to introduce it. And that way, you as the writer can better guarantee that your readers are interpreting the quote in the way that you want them to, in a way that allows you to achieve the objective of whatever it is you're writing on and why you're writing on it. Okay, lecture assignment. Using the structure we discussed, so introducing by full title, including the quote, and concluding with a statement of relevance, I want you to locate one sentence from your selected Project One artifact and compose a direct quote that introduces the work and provides a statement of relevance. Your direct quote and statement of relevance should be approximately 50 words, but can be more given the length of the work. So if you are looking at the video, if you are looking at the written works, especially if it's a little longer, that's fine. So that is what I would like you to do, again, just to get into that habit. Okay, weekly homework. So you'll want to include the core lecture 4 summary and assignment in your week 2 homework submission. Overall, your week 2 homework submission should include the summary and assignment for both core lecture 4 and core lecture 5, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. That's going to be due to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, January 20th. So if you have any questions or would like to discuss these concepts further, please feel free to contact me via Canvas's direct messaging system. All right, everyone, until next time.